Alexander Thompson, a surgeon and heir to a hospital empire, faces a dilemma: marry or lose the presidency of the company to his cousin. The solution: an unusual contract with Emily, a young artisan from Austin. But what begins as a cold agreement soon takes unexpected turns. The afternoon Chicago sun filtered through the large windows of the top-floor office at Thompson Medical Center, casting elongated shadows on the Italian marble floor. Alexander Thompson stood, gazing at the city stretching as far as his eyes could see. His green eyes, always alert and analytical, scanned the urban landscape as his mind processed the conversation he had just had with his grandmother. "Impossible," he murmured to himself, adjusting the knot of his Italian tie in an automatic gesture. His reflection in the window showed a man of impeccable appearance, a tailored suit, perfectly styled dark brown hair, and a posture that exuded power. At 32, he had built a solid reputation not only as a surgeon, but also as one of the most promising entrepreneurs in the healthcare industry. The soft sound of the door opening interrupted his thoughts. Jessica, his secretary of more than 5 years, entered with a folder of documents. "Dr. Thompson, the reports you requested," she said, placing the folder on the solid mahogany desk. "And Mrs. Margaret called again. She insists that you confirm your attendance at Sunday's dinner." Alexander let out a restrained sigh. His grandmother wouldn't give up easily, she never did. The matriarch of the Thompsons was known for her unshakable determination, the same that had turned a small neighborhood hospital into one of the largest healthcare networks in the country. "Thank her, but tell her I have a video conference with international investors," he replied without turning around. "Dr. Thompson." Jessica hesitated, knowing her boss well enough to recognize he was lying. "Mrs. Margaret said that if you don't attend, she will come to the hospital in person tomorrow." Now he turned, a half-ironic smile playing on his lips. Of course, his grandmother would do that. She knew exactly how to pressure him, as she had done all his life. "All right, Jessica. Let them know I'll be there." As soon as he was alone again, Alexander let himself sink into his leather chair, swiveling it to face the family portrait that took pride of place on the wall. In it, a younger Mrs. Margaret held the shoulders of a boy about 10 years old, himself from a time when he still smiled easily. His grandmother's demand still echoed in his mind. Either he married by the end of the year, or the presidency of the group would go to his cousin Nathan. It was a typical move from Mrs. Margaret, using the power she had to get what she wanted. And what she wanted, apparently, was to see her grandson emotionally stable, as she had put it. "As if marriage were synonymous with stability," he muttered, getting up to pour himself a drink from the small bar in his office. The amber liquid swirled in the crystal glass as his mind involuntarily drifted back to Sophia. Sophia Bennett. The name still left a bitter taste in his mouth. 3 years. How she had nearly destroyed everything his family had built over generations. Under the guise of love, she had infiltrated his life, gained his trust, and ultimately tried to sell confidential information to the Thompsons' main competitor. The phone on his desk rang, pulling him back to the present. It was Daniel, his most trusted and long-standing advisor. "Alexander, we need to talk. It's about that matter you asked me to handle. Come to my office in 15 minutes, he replied curtly, already imagining that Daniel would have updates on the group's latest acquisition. When Daniel walked in, Alexander immediately noticed that something was off. His advisor seemed nervous, which was unusual for someone always so composed. "So?" Alexander asked, gesturing to the chair in front of him. "Well?" Daniel adjusted his glasses, a habit that betrayed his discomfort. "I've been thinking about your situation with Mrs. Margaret, and I might have a solution. It's unconventional, but it could work." Alexander raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Continue. What do you think about a temporary marriage, a contract, let's say? We find someone willing to play the role of a wife for a few months long enough to satisfy Mrs. Margaret's demands and secure your position as president." The silence that followed was heavy. Alexander stood up, walking back to the window. The idea was absurd, risky, and potentially disastrous, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized it could work. "We'd need to find someone trustworthy," he finally said. "Someone who understands exactly what's at stake and has no connections to our social circle. Daniel nodded, a small smile forming on his face. Actually, I already have a candidate in mind, a young woman from Austin, with no ties to Chicago or the medical sector. She works as a barista, studies fashion, and makes handmade jewelry. From what I've researched, she's struggling financially, which would make her more receptive to the proposal. Name? Emily Carter, 26 years old. I came prepared, Daniel said, handing over a folder with basic information about the woman. Alexander quickly scanned the material. The photo showed a young woman with delicate features, expressive, brown eyes and a sincere smile. Exactly the kind of person his grandmother would approve of. Make the initial contact, he instructed, handing the folder back. But be discreet. If she shows interest, set up a meeting. I want to meet her in person before making any decisions. After Daniel left, Alexander remained for a long time, gazing out at the city. The plan was risky but calculated. A marriage of convenience, no emotions involved, just business. It was perfect for someone like him, who had long given up on the romantic notion of love. What Alexander didn't know, as he meticulously planned every detail of that agreement, was that fate had other plans. In Austin, Emily Carter was about to receive a proposal that would change her life forever, and not all the control in the world could stop what was coming. At the cafe where she worked, Emily was finishing another exhausting but satisfying day. Her handmade jewelry, displayed in a small showcase near the register, had caught the attention of a few customers. It wasn't much, but every small sale meant a step closer to her dream. "Emily, there's a gentleman asking to speak with you," said Olivia, her co-worker, pointing to a man in a suit who had just entered the cafe. Adjusting her apron and quickly checking her reflection in the coffee machine, Emily approached the customer, unaware that this moment would mark the beginning of a story that would completely change her life. If this story intrigued you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Let us know which city you're watching from and stay tuned. The man in the suit introduced himself as Daniel Harris, and his analytical gaze swept across the cafe before settling on Emily. There was something in his demeanor that instantly put her on alert, as if he were assessing every detail about her. "Miss Emily Carter?" he asked, his voice controlled and professional. "Yes, that's me," she replied, trying to maintain her composure despite her growing curiosity. "I have a job offer for you," he said, handing her a premium business card. "If you're interested in hearing more details, I'd like to schedule a formal meeting for tomorrow." Emily took the card, feeling the textured paper between her fingers. The company name was unfamiliar to her, but the address on the card indicated one of the most upscale areas of Austin. "What kind of job would it be?" she asked, her cautious nature surfacing. Daniel smiled faintly. "Something that will require absolute discretion and could completely change your life. The payment will be," he paused deliberately, "more than enough to fulfill your personal projects." At that moment, Grace, her best friend and confidant, walked into the cafe. Sensing the tension in the air, she discreetly approached the counter, keeping a watchful eye on the interaction. "And why me?" asked Emily, her voice steady despite the inner turmoil. "Let's say you have exactly the profile we're looking for," replied Daniel, adjusting his glasses. "The meeting will be tomorrow at 2 p.m. at the address on the card. If you agree to attend, I guarantee you won't regret hearing the proposal." As soon as Daniel left, Grace practically jumped over the counter to reach her friend. What was that? Who was that man? He looked like he stepped out of a spy movie. Emily showed the card to her friend, still trying to process what had just happened. "Apparently, I have a mysterious job offer to consider." "You're not thinking of going, are you?" Grace asked, the concern evident in her voice. Emily glanced at the display of her jewelry, then at the overdue utility bill in her pocket, and finally at the card in her hands. "Actually, I am." That night, in her small apartment in the suburbs of Austin, Emily couldn't sleep. Sitting on her bed, surrounded by sketches of her jewelry designs and college textbooks, she thought about her mother and sister, who depended on her financial support. The money she earned barely covered basic expenses, and her dream of having her own studio seemed increasingly distant. The next morning, Emily dressed with special care, choosing a simple yet elegant dress she had customized. Her only jewelry was a pair of earrings she had created herself, small silver works of art that always received compliments. The address led her to an imposing commercial building. At the reception, she was directed to the 20th floor, where Daniel was waiting for her in a meeting room with a panoramic view of the city. "Miss Carter, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Before we proceed, I need you to sign this confidentiality agreement." Emily read the document carefully, her hands slightly trembling. After signing, Daniel began to explain the situation, each word carefully chosen. "What I'm about to propose may seem unusual, but I ask that you keep an open mind," he began. "We're offering a temporary 3-month contract for you to play a specific role, that of a wife." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily blinked several times, trying to process what she had just heard. "Wife?" she repeated, her voice a mix of disbelief and confusion. "Exactly. You would legally marry my client, maintain appearances at social events, and after 3 months the marriage would be discreetly dissolved. In return, you would receive a significant sum, enough to pay off your debts and start your own business." Daniel's words floated in Emily's mind like loose pieces of a surreal puzzle. "Who is your client?" "Alexander Thompson," Daniel replied, sliding a photo across the table. 32 years old, a surgeon, and CEO of one of the largest hospital networks in the country. Emily picked up the photo, studying the man with a serious expression and intense eyes staring back at her from the paper. There was something magnetic about his presence, even through the photograph. "Why does he need a temporary wife?" Daniel explained the situation with Mrs. Margaret and the marriage requirement, emphasizing that it would be a purely professional arrangement. "You'll have to move to Chicago, of course. All your expenses will be covered, and you'll receive a monthly stipend in addition to the final payment." Emily's head was spinning. The proposal was absurd, unethical, and potentially dangerous, but it was also a unique opportunity to solve her financial problems and achieve her dreams. "I need to think," she said, standing up. "Naturally," Daniel replied, handing her an envelope. "Here are all the details of the agreement, including amounts and conditions. You have 24 hours to decide." As she left the building, Emily immediately called Grace. She needed to talk to someone, or she felt like she would explode. "You won't believe what just happened," she said, as soon as her friend answered. Grace nearly spilled her coffee when Emily finished recounting all the details of the proposal. They were sitting on a bench in the square near Emily's apartment, the afternoon sun beginning to set on the horizon of Austin. "Are you really considering this?" Grace asked, still processing the information. "It sounds crazy, Em. What if this Henrique guy is a psychopath?" Emily twirled the envelope between her fingers, deep in thought. "Daniel showed me all the credentials. The Thompson Empire is real. You can look it up. They own half the luxury hospitals in the country." "Still," Grace insisted, "marrying a stranger for money?" "It's not just about the money," Emily sighed, looking up at the sky, which was beginning to take on orange hues. "It's about the opportunity to finally achieve my dreams. You know how hard I've been struggling to open my own studio." The silence that followed was filled with the sound of children playing in the nearby playground. Grace knew her friend well enough to understand that once Emily set her mind on something, it was hard to talk her out of it. "If you decide to accept," Grace finally said, "promise me you'll stay in constant contact. And at the first sign of anything strange, you walk away from this." The next morning, Emily entered the same office building, this time with a decision made. Daniel was waiting for her in the same meeting room, but now there was another person present. A tall man, his back to the door, gazing out at the city through the window. "Miss Carter," Daniel greeted her, "allow me to introduce Dr. Alexander Thompson." Alexander turned around, and Emily felt the immediate impact of his presence. The photo hadn't done justice to his commanding figure. His green eyes studied her, with an unsettling intensity, as if they could read every one of her thoughts. "So you're the candidate," he said, his voice deep and controlled. It wasn't a question. "Yes," replied Emily, maintaining her composure despite her nerves. "And you're the man who needs a temporary wife." A flicker of surprise crossed Alexander's eyes, quickly replaced by what seemed to be amusement. He wasn't used to direct answers. "Daniel told me you accepted our proposal." "I haven't accepted yet," she corrected. "I have some conditions of my own." Alexander raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting that. He gestured for her to continue. "First," Emily began, "I want to keep my jewelry work. I can move to Chicago and attend social events, but I won't abandon my art." "Acceptable," Alexander replied, "as long as it's discreet and doesn't interfere with your social obligations. Second, I want written guarantees that my family will be financially protected if something goes wrong." "I've already included a clause about that in the contract," Daniel interjected, showing the document. "And third," Emily took a deep breath, "I want it to be clear that this is a professional arrangement. There will be no romantic or intimate involvement." For a moment, Alexander simply watched her, a half smile forming on his lips. "Interesting that you mentioned that. That's exactly what I was going to propose." In the following minutes, they discussed the practical details of the agreement. Emily would move to Chicago the following week. They would have a few days to get to know each other better and craft a convincing story about their relationship before being officially introduced to society. "One last thing," Alexander said, as they were about to wrap up the meeting. "My grandmother is extremely sharp. If we're going to make this work, we need to be convincing, very convincing." "Are you saying we need to rehearse?" asked Emily, a hint of irony in her voice. "I'm saying we need to look like a couple in love, not two strangers fulfilling a contract," he replied, his eyes locked on hers. "Do you think you can do that?" "I can do anything I set my mind to, Dr. Thompson," she answered, holding his gaze. "The question is, can you?" The tension in the air was palpable. Daniel cleared his throat discreetly, breaking the moment. "Well, I guess we have a deal then. I'll arrange the necessary documents." When Emily left the building that afternoon, her head was spinning. She had just agreed to take part in an elaborate charade with one of the most powerful men in Chicago. Her life was about to change drastically, and she had no idea if she was ready for what was coming. The next day, she began preparing for her move. Grace helped her sort through her clothes, trying to determine what would be appropriate for her new life. "You're going to need a completely new wardrobe," Grace commented, critically examining the most formal dress Emily owned. "Daniel said there will be a credit card available for that," Emily replied, still trying to get used to the idea of having access to virtually unlimited resources. As she organized her jewelry, each piece carefully crafted by her own hands, Emily wondered what her life would be like over the next 3 months. What would it be like to live with Alexander Thompson? What would it be like to pretend to be in love with someone who had clearly built walls around himself? In Chicago, Alexander was also preparing for the changes ahead. In his office at the hospital, he reviewed the contract one last time when his grandmother walked in unannounced. "So it's true?" asked Margaret, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Have you finally found someone?" Alexander kept his expression neutral, though his heart had quickened slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about, Grandma." "Oh, don't play dumb," she laughed, sitting down across from him. "Your cousin's already told me you've been leaving the hospital early, making mysterious calls. How long have you been dating this girl?" "A few months," he replied, remembering the story he had concocted with Daniel. "I wanted to be sure before introducing her to the family." Mrs. Margaret studied him intently, as if trying to read beyond his words. "Does she make you happy?" The question caught Alexander off guard. For a moment, the image of Emily's determined eyes flashed in his mind. "She's different," he finally answered. "Different how?" "You'll see for yourself at Sunday's dinner," he said, deflecting. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have surgery in half an hour." After his grandmother left, Alexander remained in his office, lost in thought. The plan was in motion and there was no turning back. In a few days, Emily Carter would officially enter his life, and he needed to ensure everything worked perfectly. The morning Emily arrived in Chicago was exceptionally clear. The driver sent by Alexander waited for her at the airport with a discreet sign, and she felt the weight of her decision as she walked toward the luxurious car. During the ride to the apartment that would be her new home for the next 3 months, Emily watched the city through the car window, So different from Austin. Chicago pulsed with its own energy, imposing and somewhat intimidating, not unlike the man she was about to marry. "And we've arrived, miss," the driver announced, parking in front of an elegant building in the Upper East Side. The apartment was exactly like the photos Daniel had shown her, spacious, decorated with sophisticated minimalism, and with a stunning view of the city. In the kitchen, Emily found a note from Alexander. "We have dinner with my grandmother tonight at 8 p.m. The driver will be at your disposal for any necessary shopping. A personal stylist will arrive at 2 p.m. to assist you. Be punctual. A. Tay?" Emily couldn't help but smile ironically. Even in a simple note, Alexander managed to sound authoritative. Right at 2 p.m., the doorbell rang. An elegant woman, who introduced herself as Victoria, arrived with a full beauty team and several racks of clothes. "Dr. Thompson was very specific about what he's looking for," explained Victoria, assessing Emily with a professional gaze. "We want something sophisticated, but that still reflects your personality. After all, according to the official story, it was your authenticity that won him over." The next few hours were a whirlwind of outfit fittings, makeup adjustments, and tips on social etiquette. Emily felt like an actress, preparing for the most important role of her life. "Remember," Victoria said, as she adjusted the emerald green dress Emily would wear to dinner, "Mrs. Margaret Thompson is known for her ability to read people. You need to appear genuinely in love." "How can someone appear genuinely in love when it's not real?" Emily questioned, studying her reflection in the mirror. Victoria smiled, taming a rebellious curl in Emily's hair. "Darling, in your social circle, half of the marriages that seem perfect are based on arrangements. The difference is that some learn to turn convenience into something real." At 7:45 p.m., Alexander arrived at the apartment. When Emily opened the door, there was a moment of mutual silence. She looked stunning in the dress that perfectly matched his eyes, her brown hair cascading in soft waves over her shoulders. Alexander, in turn, was impeccable in a dark Italian suit. "You look—" He paused, seeming to search for the right word appropriate. "Wow, how romantic," she replied, rolling her eyes. "Your grandmother is going to love this tender side of you." "Speaking of which," he said, stepping into the apartment, "we need to iron out some details. How did we meet?" "I've already memorized the story Daniel came up with," Emily answered, grabbing her bag. "We met at a charity event in Austin where I was showcasing my jewelry. You were captivated by my work, we started talking and—" "No," Alexander interrupted, frowning. "That won't work with my grandmother. It's too artificial." "And what's your suggestion, Dr. Thompson?" she asked, crossing her arms. "First, stop calling me doctor. We're supposedly a couple in love." He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. "Second, the truth always works better than a lie. Let's keep as much of reality as possible." "How so?" "You really work at a coffee shop and make jewelry, right? So let's say I was in Austin for a medical conference. I walked into your coffee shop and fell madly in love with my cappuccino." She finished with sarcasm. To her surprise, a small smile appeared on Alexander's lips. "No. I fell in love with the way you treated every customer as unique, how you spoke passionately about your creations when someone asked about the jewelry on display. I fell in love with your authenticity." Emily felt something strange in her stomach. For a moment, the intensity in Alexander's gaze almost made her believe his words. "You're good at this," she said softly. "At lying?" he asked, still keeping his eyes fixed on her. "At seeming sincere." The moment was interrupted by Alexander's phone. "The car is waiting," he said, returning to his usual demeanor. "Remember, my grandmother is very observant. Every gesture, every look needs to be convincing." In the elevator, Alexander surprised Emily by slipping his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "We need to look comfortable with each other," he explained, noticing her startle. His cologne overwhelmed her senses, an expensive masculine fragrance that perfectly matched his personality. Emily forced herself to relax, reminding herself that this was just a job, an act. In the car, Alexander briefed her on the final details. "My grandmother will probably ask a lot of questions about your family, your future plans." "I know how to handle people, Alexander," Emily interrupted. "It might not seem like it, but I know how to behave in social situations. That's not what worries me, he replied, his tone softer. It's just my grandmother has... The Thompson mansion was an imposing structure in the heart of Beverly Hills, with meticulously maintained gardens and architecture that blended classic and contemporary elements. When the car stopped in front of the main gate, Emily felt her heart race. "Take a deep breath," Alexander murmured, surprising her with a gentle gesture as he held her hand. "Remember, we're a couple in love." The butler who greeted them had a demeanor as formal as the house he served. He led them through a hall decorated with impressive works of art to an elegant living room, where Mrs. Margaret awaited them. The matriarch of the Thompsons was seated in a vintage armchair, her posture upright and elegant despite her age. Her eyes, the same intense green as her grandson's, immediately fixed on Emily. "So this is the young woman who achieved the impossible," said Mrs. Margaret, a small smile playing on her lips. "Winning my grandson's heart." Emily felt Alexander tense slightly beside her but remained calm. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson, sometimes I wonder if it wasn't him who won mine." The response seemed to please the matriarch, who gestured for them to sit. "Please call me Margaret, and tell me, how did you two meet? Alexander has been so mysterious about it." Before Alexander could intervene, Emily began recounting the version they had agreed upon, but adding details that made the story more personal and genuine. "He walked into the cafe on a particularly tough day," she said, a genuine smile appearing on her lips as she recalled her own routine at the cafe. "I had spilled coffee on a customer minutes before. My jewelry wasn't selling well that week, and I was worried about tuition fees." Mrs. Margaret leaned slightly forward, intrigued. Alexander watched Emily with a mix of surprise and admiration for how she carried the narrative. Alexander ordered a simple black coffee, no sugar, Emily continued, but he noticed the small display with my jewelry and started asking questions about the creative process, about how I chose the materials. He was the first person that day who truly seemed interested in my work, not just politely curious. "And what drew you to him, besides his interest in your creations?" asked Mrs. Margaret, her eyes attentive to every reaction. Emily turned to Alexander, her eyes meeting his sincerity. Even when he tried to maintain that serious, important doctor demeanor, there was something in his eyes, a vulnerability he tried to hide. For a moment, something flickered across Alexander's face, an emotion Emily couldn't quite place. He gently squeezed her hand, a gesture that seemed more instinctive than calculated. "And you, Alexander? What did you see in this young woman that made you let your guard down?" asked Mrs. Margaret. Alexander kept his eyes fixed on Emily as he replied, "Her authenticity. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, nor did she change her behavior depending on who she was dealing with. She was simply herself, with a strength and determination that intrigued me from the very beginning." The dinner that followed was a surreal experience for Emily. The food was exceptional, served on fine porcelain plates with silver cutlery. The conversation flowed naturally, with Mrs. Margaret sharing stories from Alexander's childhood, which made him alternate between expressions of embarrassment and nostalgia. "He's always been determined," Mrs. Margaret commented as they enjoyed dessert. "At 5 years old, he declared he would become a doctor after receiving a toy doctor's kit. He never changed his mind." "Some decisions are for a lifetime," Alexander replied, his gaze meeting Emily's with an intensity that made her blush. After dinner, Mrs. Margaret invited Emily on a tour of the mansion, leaving Alexander behind for a moment. As they walked through the hallways adorned with family photos, the matriarch began asking more personal questions. "Your parents must be proud of your achievements," she remarked, stopping in front of an old portrait. "My mother is my biggest supporter," Emily replied sincerely. "She always taught me to fight for my dreams even when the path seemed impossible." "And your father?" "He left us when I was little," Emily said, keeping her voice steady. "But that only made my mother stronger. She worked twice as hard to give me an education and support my interest in art and design." Mrs. Margaret observed her with a penetrating gaze. "You know, Emily, when you reach my age, you learn to read people, to see beyond appearances." Emily's heart raced, but she maintained her composure. "And what do you see when you look at me?" "I see a young woman who understands the value of hard work," Mrs. Margaret replied, an enigmatic smile on her lips. "Someone who doesn't let themselves be defined by circumstances. Maybe that's exactly what my grandson needs." When they returned to the living room, they found Alexander in what seemed like a tense phone conversation. Upon seeing them, he quickly ended the call. "Any issues at the hospital?" asked Mrs. Margaret. "Nothing that can't wait until tomorrow," he replied. But Emily noticed a shadow of concern on his face. On the way back to the apartment, Alexander was quieter than usual. Emily waited until they were in the elevator to ask, "The phone call, was it something serious?" "Sophia is back in town," he replied curtly. "Apparently she's been showing interest in our new hospital acquisitions." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She had studied enough about Alexander's past to know exactly who Sophia Bennett was and what her presence could mean. "This could complicate things," she said softly. Alexander looked at her, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "I won't let her interfere with our plans, but we need to be even more careful now." When they arrived at the apartment, Emily sensed that something had shifted between them. The shared experience of dinner, the veiled threat of Sophia's presence, it had all created a kind of complicity that hadn't existed before. "You were amazing today," Alexander said, surprising her. "My grandmother was clearly impressed." "I was just being myself," Emily replied, slipping off her heels, with a few romanticized details, of course. For a moment, Alexander seemed like he wanted to say something more, but he held back. "Good night, Emily," he said, heading to the door. "Good night, darling," she replied with a provocative smile. The look he gave her before leaving held a mix of amusement and something more, something that made Emily's heart beat a little faster than it should. The days that followed were a whirlwind of social events, public appearances, and adjustments to her new life. Emily discovered that the world of the Thompsons was far more complex than she had initially imagined. Every dinner, every charity event, every casual encounter was carefully orchestrated to maintain appearances and strengthen business alliances. On a particularly hectic morning, Emily was organizing her jewelry in the small studio Alexander had allowed her to set up in one of the apartment's rooms when she heard the doorbell. To her surprise, it was Daniel. "Emily, we need to talk," he said, his tone more serious than usual. "Some complications have arisen." She led him to the living room, noticing the tension in his shoulders. "Does this have something to do with Sophia?" "Partially," Daniel replied, adjusting his glasses. "She's been asking questions, digging into your past in Austin. But there's more. The press has started showing interest in your story with Alexander." "What do you mean?" "Apparently, someone leaked information about the powerful Dr. Thompson's romance with a simple barista. They're fascinated by the modern-day fairy tale." Emily sat down, processing the information. "This wasn't part of the plan?" "No, it wasn't," Daniel agreed, "but it could work in our favor. A love story like this helps humanize Alexander's image, which is excellent for business. However, it increases the pressure on us," she finished. "More eyes watching, more people questioning." At that moment, Alexander walked into the apartment, surprising both of them. His expression was heavy. "I assume Daniel has already updated you on the situation," he said, loosening his tie. "We'll have to adjust our strategy." "What do you mean?" asked Emily. "From now on, you'll come work with me at the hospital a few mornings a week," Alexander explained. "Supposedly to get to know the family business better. This will give us more visibility as a couple and keep the press satisfied." Emily frowned. "What about my jewelry, my work?" "You can continue with that in your free afternoons," he replied, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Right now, our priority is maintaining appearances." "No," said Emily, standing up. "I'm not abandoning my work. Doing this a few times a week to keep up appearances is one thing, but I won't set aside my personal projects." Alexander stared at her, surprised by her resistance. Daniel discreetly stood up, murmuring something about having other commitments, and left, leaving them alone. "Emily," Alexander began, his tone softer, "I need you to understand the seriousness of the situation. Sophia isn't someone we can underestimate. If she finds out the truth about our arrangement..." I understand perfectly, Emily interrupted. But you also need to understand that I'm not a puppet you can manipulate at your convenience. I've been clear from the beginning about my terms. To her surprise, Alexander didn't react with irritation. Instead, a small smile appeared on his lips. You really aren't afraid to face me, are you? Why should I be? She replied, holding his gaze. Beneath all that power and untouchable CEO persona, you're just a man trying to prove something to your grandmother. The comment struck Alexander deeper than he cared to admit. For a moment, his mask of control faltered, and Emily caught a glimpse of something in his eyes. Vulnerability, perhaps? Fine, he said finally. Keep your job with the jewelry, but on the days you come to the hospital, I need you to be flawless. The press will be watching your every move. I can do. To that, Emily agreed, but on one condition. What? You need to start treating me like a partner in this arrangement, not like an employee you can order around. Alexander studied her for a long moment, as if truly seeing her for the first time. Fair enough, he finally replied. Partners. Then. In the days that followed, Emily discovered that working at the hospital had its own complexities. The staff treated her with a mix of curiosity and respect, while the patients seemed charmed by the story of the young artisan who had won the heart of the powerful Dr. Thompson. One morning, Emily was in the hospital cafe, waiting for Alexander to finish a surgery when an elegant woman approached her table. So you're the famous Emily, the woman said, sitting down uninvited. I must admit, you're not quite what I expected. Something in the woman's tone made Emily sit up straighter. And you are Sophia Bennett, she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But I imagine Alexander has already spoken about me. Emily maintained her composure, though her heart had quickened. Actually, he rarely mentions the past. Understandable, said Sophia, leaning slightly forward. Some stories are too painful to share. But you know, Emily, there's something about you that intrigues me. How did a simple barista manage to win over someone so... Before Sophia could finish her provocative sentence, Alexander appeared in the hospital cafe, still wearing his medical coat. His eyes narrowed as he took in the scene, and his posture immediately stiffened. Sophia, he said, his voice icy, I wasn't aware you had clearance to roam the restricted areas of the hospital. Dear Alexander, she replied with a calculated smile. I just came to meet your fiancé. After all, everyone is talking about this unexpected romance. Emily felt the tension in the air, thick like a storm about to break. Alexander stepped closer, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. If you'll excuse us, he said to Sophia, I have an appointment with my fiancé. In the private elevator leading to Alexander's office, the silence was deafening. Emily could feel the tension radiating from him in waves. Are you okay? She asked softly. Alexander let out a heavy sigh. Sophia has always had a special talent for showing up at the most inconvenient times. She didn't intimidate me, if that's what worries you. He looked at her with an expression that mixed surprise and something else, something that made Emily's heart beat a little faster. No, I imagine not, he replied, a small smile appearing on his lips. You're stronger than you seem. The office, Alexander began pacing back and forth, his mind clearly working on something. We need to move up the wedding, he finally said. Isabella's presence has changed everything. She's plotting something, I can feel it. Move it up, but what about all the preparations? Your grandmother, my grandmother will be thrilled with the idea of a more intimate and romantic wedding, he interrupted. As for the preparations, I have a team that can organize everything in 2 weeks. Emily sat down, trying to process the sudden change of plans. 2 weeks? Alexander, this is crazy. It's necessary, he insisted, stopping in front of her. Isabella isn't here by chance. She found out something about the merger we're planning with the Southern Hospital Network, and she's using our story as an excuse to get closer. And by getting married sooner, you think she'll give up? No, he replied, sitting down beside her. But it will give us more credibility. A passionate couple who can't wait to make it official is far more convincing than a long, calculated engagement. Emily watched him for a moment, noticing the faint lines of worry on his face. It was easy to forget sometimes the weight he carried, the responsibility of protecting the empire his family had built. "All right," she finally said, "but on one condition." "What is it?" "I want my mother and sister to come to Chicago. If we're going to do this, I need my family close by." Alexander nodded, surprising her with his quick agreement. "I should have suggested this earlier. Family is important. Your mother must be worried about all this sudden change in your life." There was something in the way he said the word family that touched Emily. Behind the facade of a successful businessman, there was a man who understood the value of emotional bonds, even if he tried to hide it. The next morning, Mrs. Margaret showed up at the apartment unannounced, finding Emily in her small jewelry studio. "Alexander told me about the wedding being moved up," said the matriarch, observing with interest the pieces Emily was creating. "I must admit I was surprised." "Mrs. Thompson in Margaret," Emily corrected herself upon seeing the older woman's gaze. "I know it might seem rushed." "On the contrary," interrupted Mrs. Margaret, picking up one of the necklaces Emily had just finished. "I think it's exactly what you both need. You know, when I married Alexander's grandfather, it was also quick. Sometimes, when you know it's right, there's no reason to wait." Emily felt a pang of guilt. The sincerity in Mrs. Margaret's tone made her question the entire charade. "This necklace," continued the matriarch, "has something special about it. The way you combine the stones, it reminds me a lot of a piece that belonged to my grandmother." "It's inspired by nature," Emily explained, grateful for the change of subject. "The stones are arranged as if they were dewdrops on a web." "You have a gift," said Mrs. Margaret, carefully placing the necklace back. "And more importantly, you have passion for what you do. That's what I saw in you from the very beginning, this ability to fully commit to what you believe in." The matriarch's words echoed in Emily's mind long after she left. That evening, when Alexander arrived to discuss the wedding details, he found her deep in thought on the apartment's terrace. "Something wrong?" he asked, noticing her distant expression. "Your grandmother was here today," replied Emily. "She's different than I imagined." "How so?" "More perceptive, more human?" he completed with a small smile. "Yes, that's the effect she has on people. Behind the ruthless businesswoman, there's a woman who has seen and lived a lot." They fell silent for a moment, watching the city lights. "Alexander," Emily finally said, "what if she finds out about us, about the agreement?" He turned to face her, his features partially lit by the city lights. "Do you regret it?" "That's not it," she replied, surprised by the question. "It's just, the more time passes, the harder it gets to keep the lies separate from the truth." Alexander took a step toward her, and Emily felt her heart race at his closeness. "Maybe," he said softly, "not everything is a lie." Before Emily could process the meaning of those words, Alexander's phone rang, breaking the moment. It was Daniel with urgent news about the hospital merger. As she watched him take the call and quickly revert to his professional demeanor, Emily realized she was in dangerous territory. What had started as a business arrangement was turning into something more complicated, something neither she nor Alexander had anticipated. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a whirlwind of activity. Emily's apartment turned into a planning headquarters, with vendors, decorators, and the event team constantly coming and going. The arrival of her mother, Elizabeth, and her younger sister, Charlotte, brought a new dynamic to the situation. Alexander arranged a comfortable apartment for them in the same building, and Emily was surprised by how naturally he interacted with her family. "He's nothing like I imagined," Elizabeth commented one evening as she helped Emily organize some of her jewelry. "When you told me about the whirlwind romance with a wealthy doctor, I admit I was apprehensive, but there's something genuine about him." Emily felt the weight of guilt in her chest. Her mother, who had always been her best friend and confidant, didn't know the truth about the arrangement. "Mom," she began hesitantly, "sometimes things aren't exactly what they seem." "Oh, sweetheart," Elizabeth interrupted with an understanding smile. "Few things in life are exactly what they seem. What matters is what we feel here." She gently touched Emily's chest over her heart. At that very moment, Alexander was in His office at the hospital, reviewing some documents when Daniel entered hurriedly. "We have a problem," he announced, closing the door. "Sophia has scheduled a meeting with the board for next week. She's claiming to have information that could jeopardize the merger." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "What kind of information?" "We're not sure, but she seems very confident, and there's more." She's been asking questions about Emily, about how you two really met. The mention of Emily's name shifted something in Alexander's expression. "She won't get anywhere. The wedding is in 3 days, and after that..." "After that what?" Daniel questioned, watching his friend closely. "Alexander, are you sure you're still following the original plan?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been watching you with Emily. The way you look at her, how you act when she's around. Is this still just a business arrangement?" Alexander stood up, walking over to the window. The nighttime city stretched out before him, but his thoughts were elsewhere. "Don't complicate things, Daniel," he finally said. "We have a plan and we're sticking to it." But that night when he got home, Alexander found Emily asleep on the couch, surrounded by invitation samples and guest lists. There was something vulnerable about her figure, something that made his chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain. Gently, he removed the papers from her lap and grabbed a blanket to cover her. As he was about to step away, Emily murmured something in her sleep and shifted slightly. A strand of hair fell across her face, and before he could stop himself, Alexander brushed it away softly. The simple gesture made him pause, surprised by his own impulse. Daniel's words echoed in his mind. Was he really in control of the situation? The next morning, during breakfast, Emily noticed something different about Alexander. He seemed more distant, more formal than usual. "Did something happen?" she asked, pouring him a cup of coffee. "Sophia scheduled a meeting with the board," he replied after a moment of hesitation. "She's trying to interfere with the merger." "And does that have something to do with me? With us?" Alexander looked at her over his coffee cup. "She's asking questions about how we met." "I understand," said Emily softly. "Does this change anything in our plans?" "No," he replied quickly, perhaps too quickly. "The wedding will happen as planned. Afterward, when the merger is secured..." He didn't finish the sentence, and Emily felt something strange in her stomach. It was easy to forget, amidst the preparations and daily interactions, that all of this had an expiration date. "Of course," she said, standing up from the table. "Well, I need to go. I have a dress fitting today with your grandmother." "Emily," he called as she was about to leave, "are you okay with all of this?" She turned, meeting his eyes. For a moment, she wanted to tell the truth, that she wasn't okay, that something had changed, that her feelings were becoming more and more confused, but instead she forced a smile. "Perfectly fine, Dr. Thompson. After all, we're just business partners, aren't we?" The way she said his formal title hit him in an unexpected way. Alexander wanted to say something, to stop her from leaving, but the words got stuck in his throat. At the dress fitting, Mrs. Margaret watched Emily closely as the stylist made the final adjustments. "You know," the matriarch began, "when Alexander was little, he had a favorite book about a prince who built walls around his castle to protect himself. But in the end, he discovered that the walls not only kept people out but also prevented him from truly living." Emily met Mrs. Margaret's eyes in the mirror. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because sometimes we need someone brave enough to tear down our walls," she replied with an enigmatic smile, "even when we pretend we don't want them to fall." The matriarch's words stayed with Emily for the rest of the day. That night, alone in her apartment, she allowed herself to think about what would happen after the wedding. The idea of returning to her normal life in Austin, of not seeing Alexander every day, of no longer having those late-night conversations on the terrace. Why did it bother her so much now? Her phone buzzed with a message from Alexander. "Can we talk? I'm coming up." Emily stared at the screen for a long moment, her heart racing involuntarily. When Alexander arrived at the apartment, he found Emily on the balcony, gazing at the illuminated city. For a moment, he stood in the doorway, admiring how she seemed to belong to that landscape, as if she had always been meant to be there. "We need to talk," he said, stepping closer. Emily turned, and the city lights reflected in her eyes in a way that made Alexander's heart skip a beat. "About the meeting with the board?" she asked, trying to maintain the professional tone that had defined their relationship from the start. "No," he replied, taking another step toward her. "About us." The word hung between them, heavy with unspoken meanings. Before Emily could respond, Alexander continued. "Today, during surgery, something happened. It was a routine procedure, something I've done hundreds of times, but for the first time in years my hands shook." "Why?" she asked softly. "Because I realized I've been lying to myself. For years, I've built walls around me, convinced it was the only way to protect myself. But now," he paused, searching for the right words, "now I realize those walls weren't just protecting me, they were keeping me from living." Emily felt her heart race, but remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "The agreement we made, it started as the perfect plan, practical, efficient, no emotional complications. But something changed, Emily. You changed everything." At that moment, Alexander's phone rang. It was Daniel, probably with news about Sophia and the board. But for the first time in his life, Alexander ignored the call. "When Sophia showed up," he continued, "it wasn't jealousy or anger that I felt, it was fear. Not of losing the merger or the presidency, but of losing you. That she might expose our charade, and that it would mean you walking away." "Alexander," Emily began, her voice trembling slightly. "Let me finish," he pleaded, now so close he could smell her soft perfume. "Tomorrow is our wedding, a wedding that started as a business arrangement, but has turned into something I can no longer pretend is just a transaction." Emily felt tears forming in her eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want to pretend anymore. I don't want a 3-month marriage. I don't want an agreement with an expiration date. I want you, Emily. With your handmade jewelry, your stubbornness, your ability to see through my defenses. But what about Sophia, the board, your grandmother? Sophia can do whatever she wants. The board can question my business decisions. And my grandmother." A smile appeared on her lips. "I think she knew before both of us." At that moment, the apartment door opened and Mrs. Margaret entered, followed by Daniel. Both stopped when they saw the scene on the balcony. "Sorry to interrupt," said Daniel, looking uncomfortable, "but Sophia is threatening to go to the press. She claims to have proof of your agreement." To everyone's surprise, Alexander laughed. "Let her go. There's no more agreement to expose." Mrs. Margaret stepped closer, a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. "Finally realized, my grandson?" "You knew from the beginning, didn't you, Grandma?" asked Alexander, still not taking his eyes off Emily. "Of course I knew," replied the matriarch with a smile. "But some lessons need to be learned on your own. True love can't be forged or contracted. It simply happens even when we try to protect ourselves from it." Emily looked at Alexander, years of doubts and fears dissolving in a single moment of clarity. "So no more pretending?" "No," he replied, holding her hands. "Tomorrow when I say yes, it will be for real. If you want it." Emily's answer came in the form of a kiss, right there under the city lights and in front of the witnesses who had followed their journey from the beginning. The next day, when Emily entered the church wearing a dress she had helped design herself, with small details of handmade jewelry that told her story, there was no more agreement or contract. There was only love, the kind of love that blossoms in the most unexpected places, overcoming the barriers of fear and distrust. Alexander, as he watched her walk toward him, knew that all the walls he had built over the years had finally come down, and in their place there was something much stronger. The certainty that sometimes the best plans are the ones that go wrong in the most right way possible. And as they exchanged their vows, they were no longer the powerful businessman and the simple artisan pretending a romance. It was just Alexander and Emily, two hearts that found in each other the courage to believe in love again. Mrs. Margaret, watching the scene with tears in her eyes, knew her plan had worked better than she could have ever imagined. Sometimes, she thought, all we need is a little nudge from fate or a persistent grandmother to find the path to true happiness. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Alexander and Emily has touched your hearts. To continue this journey of emotions, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it here by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed this love story that began with an agreement and blossomed into something real, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give the video a like. Every day we bring you unique stories that explore the complexity of human emotions. Share your own tales of unexpected love with us in the comments. After all, sometimes the best romances start in the most unlikely ways.